in the first 6 months. That's more than 9/11, that's more than Pearl Harbor. This was a tremendous disaster. So, but in any event, Hartigan's poked around. He knows he can close on this ship, and they get in front of Jack's Beach. And Jack's Beach it's a Friday night. It is lit up like a Christmas tree. There are 2 Ferris wheels, there's a roller coaster, there are people driving up and down the beach, and the Jacksonville Beach Volunteer Fire Department is having its first annual Fireman's Ball on the old wooden pier with the 7-Up sign. In fact, out there, it's there. See the 7-Up sign, how it glows? I love that in that picture. And so Hartigan closes on him. He comes in behind the Gulf of America. And what he should have done at this point is he should have gone back out to sea, gone around the buoy that marks the St. John's, and tried to intercept this oil tanker again off of St. Mary's or Brunswick, Georgia. But he doesn't. He's coming in, I'll do a thing, he's coming in at an angle, 45-degree angle behind. What their Germans really wanted was to be at that 90-degree angle, to give them the best chance to hit with the torpedo. He's coming in at a 45-degree angle behind. I mention this because I think it's important when we talk about why he's going to do what he does next. But he shoots from about 2,000 yards, he fires the torpedo. At around 10:20 at night, by the official time. And he fires his torpedo at this 45-degree angle. It takes too long to hit. He thinks he's missed. He thinks he's wasted his second to last torpedo. And then suddenly at 10:24, there's this huge explosion 4 miles out to sea, almost immediately off, a little south of where the Jack's Pier is now. So right out there, right off the coast. People come running from everywhere. People are already on the beach. People are already in the beaches, in the bars, in the casinos, in the bingo halls, in the movies. But they come running, they hear this explosion, they come running from everywhere, and they watch. And what happens next is that the U-boat commander decides to pilot his boat around the stern of the Gulf of America, so that he is now on the landward side of the boat. So he is between the ship. He's between the Gulf of America and the coast, which creates this silhouette that everyone on the beach can see. And you're there, right?
No.
You saw
I saw the whole thing from my house.
You saw the silhouette?
I saw everything. It scared us to death.
We'll talk to you some more. We'll get you into it. I just want to confirm you could see this thing, right? You could see it. You knew what it was. He's nodding his head yes.
The nice thing about the German submarine, he stayed south of the tanker for all his torpedoes and cannon fire and machine gun bullets and tracers would ricochet off and go north and not come to the shoreline. Not a single shot hit the shoreline. The skipper of the submarine was very nice about that.
Yeah. No, he does not shoot. And in fact, in his book that he writes, and in some of the interviews he gives, he says that he goes to the landward side because he's scared that he will fire over the Gulf of America, miss, and hit the people on the beach.
He was very careful not to do that.
Additionally, people have argued that because there was a land breeze that night, and because the flames were blowing out to sea, that he was safer on the landward side. Finally, the boat is listing to starboard because they've been struck on the starboard side. So the hull is up on the land side. And they would have wanted to make sure this ship didn't get salvaged and put back in service. So they would have had a better opportunity to sink it from that side. The final possibility, and my personal favorite, I think more than anything else, that Hartigan put himself between the Gulf of America and the beach was to create a spectacular display. And he becomes famous for this back in Germany. Hitler, that very week, goes to the Reichstag and brags that his submarines are sinking American ships within sight of American cities.
He scared all of us. Everybody on the shore was fighting the Germans were coming.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Let's just, bananas. Everybody see the bananas one since that's up? 2 nights before he sinks the Gulf of America, he sinks a ship called the Esparta. And the Esparta is owned by the United Fruit Company. And it's a refrigerated fruit boat. And apparently, a lot of things wash up on shore. There are stories that some dead bodies washed ashore. We know with absolute certainty for decades after the event, that tar washes ashore. And you would go swimming, and you would come out of the water, or you would walk on the beach, and you would have this black tar on your feet. Does anyone else besides me remember this?
You couldn't walk on the beach for at least 2 years. It was loaded with black tar.
And you would use turpentine or lighter fluid to take it off.
Burn like sin, too.
Yeah. So the beach was covered, but in addition, bananas washed ashore. And if you read it, the Department of Health said the bananas are fine to eat, you just should wash them. Wash them carefully. So in any event, he sinks the boat, he comes around to the landward side, he begins to machine gun the radio antenna so that the Gulf of America cannot send out a distress signal. And at the same time, they take their 10.5 centimeter deck gun and they begin to shell and fire approximately a dozen shells into the bottom of the hull of the Gulf of America, sinking it forever, although it takes a while. The ship is 485 feet long. It has 90,000 barrels of kerosene. That's what empties into the ocean, as well as possibly another 10,000 barrels of diesel fuel that was to run the ship. It's the kerosene that creates the big explosion. Passing Eastern Airlines flight reports that the flames are 500 feet in the air. And that's just a domestic flight that happened to be flying by from Miami to New York. So they shell it, they take off, the ship settles by the stern, and the bow, and there's a picture of that in there too, the bow bobs on the surface for 6 days before finally sinking. If you read either the New York the Times Union article or the article in Newsline that I wrote, you know that it's a fish haven and a dive destination to this day. You can go out and dive on the Gulf of America if you're into diving. Hartigan leaves. Later that, because of the events that had occurred 2 and 3 nights earlier, the Navy had dispatched a destroyer from Miami called the USS Dahlgren. And later that night, after he sinks the Gulf of America, he suddenly realizes that there's a fishing boat nearby that is signaling that they can see a U-boat. And he checks the coordinates and realizes they're talking about him. And then he sees a boat, another ship, approaching very fast. So he dives. And the Dahlgren passes over the Gulf of America and launches a depth charge array. And the depth charges do severe damage to the U-123. Such damage that Hartigan's prepared to abandon his submarine. And they begin to prepare to flood the submarine, and they would put on gas masks, little air breathing masks, and float to the surface. And they're ready to do this. And Hartigan goes to open the hatch, and the cold water splashes his face and scares him. And he tries a second time, and he's even more scared. And so he decides, in that moment, he can hear the Dahlgren taking off, leaving the scene. And he decides he'll stay on the bottom and try and fix the boat, which he does. He fixes it well enough that the night later they sink 2 more ships off of Cape Canaveral within 4 miles of each other. And they then head home to Germany. And when he gets to Germany, he writes a book. And the book's called Aufgefechtsstationen, which means essentially 2 battle stations. It's a bestseller in Germany in 1943. It's co-written by Admiral Dönitz, who's the commander of the entire, well, eventually he becomes the Führer of Germany at the very end. But he's commander of the entire German Navy. And he meets Hitler. Hitler gives him a Knight's Cross with oak leaves. And he lives quite a good life. He becomes an oil executive, works for Texaco for a while, despite sinking the SS Oklahoma, which was one of their boats. He becomes quite a good golfer. He becomes a member of the Bundestag, which is essentially like our parliament, like a parliament. And probably, in some ways, maybe the most interesting thing about Reinhard Hartigan is he's still alive today. He's 104 years old and he still lives in Bremen, Germany. And sometimes I give this speech in the mornings and I'll say, I like to think he's in a senior center in Bremen hearing about how we won the war, right? Just a couple things on some of the people. Oh, let's talk about time for a minute, because I said I do want to talk about time. I have two sort of controversial theories. One is that Hartigan did this partially for the publicity. And I believe that. He had tried to sink a ship off New York on his first trip to America in January of 1942. He'd actually piloted the ship into New York, his submarine into New York Harbor. He almost ran it aground on Sandy Hook. And he was looking, he let everybody come up on deck, much as he did here in St. Augustine, and look at the lights of New York. And no ships, no oil tankers came along for him to sink while he was there. He eventually sinks a ship called the Coimbra, about 60 miles off Long Island, about 90 miles from New York. And they could hear that, the explosion on Long Island. So 60 miles, you can hear the explosion. 4 miles, you can imagine how terrified people were. The other thing is, what time was it? Well, let me give my theory and then you can tell me what you think. Maybe you remember. Basically, we know what time the torpedo hits because we know what time it was in Germany. And every German military unit, every occupied territory, every consul, every embassy, everybody that the Germans were controlling at that point was on the same time. And it was German wartime. It was essentially Central European time +2. So double daylight savings. Now based on that, we know that it was 10:20 Eastern War time in Jack's Beach, the night that the submarine launches the torpedo. The thing is that wartime was essentially year-round daylight savings time. And Congress had authorized this at the end of January 1942 to take effect February 8, 1942. So the question is, did the people on the beach think it was 10:20, or were they still on the old time and thinking to themselves that it was 9:20? And I suspect that they thought it was 9:20. Most of the first-hand recollections indicate it happened between 9 and 10, not between 10 and 11. A lot of the stories, Townsend Hawks being a famous one, he talks about how he's coming home from having dinner at his mother's house, which seems more likely at 9:30 than 10:30. Jean Swanson, who taught at Fletcher and every year gave a speech about this event to the students, says she was in the movies. And forget it, I think she's 11 years old at the time. And again, if we believe the story, then 9:20 makes more sense than 10:20. Townsend Hawks is the most famous. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say I wasn't there. I was in a Model 8 Ford with my mom and dad, and I was very young. And either I remember hearing it, or maybe it's just my mom and dad talking about it. I really can't distinguish the difference. But I would guess, and this is really weak, but certainly we were headed to Palm Valley. And I'd take the earlier time. We didn't stay up that late, you know, there's kerosene lamps. I remember my mom talking about silverware washing up on the beach. And all kinds of.
There could be, you know, stuff washes up on the beach from wrecks, and there would have been, you know, all sorts of stuff. I know I've heard bodies, the biggest thing being the tar. What time do you think it was, since you were there?
Me?
Yeah.
We watched it from our house, I guess it's 9 o'clock, 9:30, something like that, it wasn't late. But
You know-
we were all frightened and we had no defense against that German submarine. We called the Coast Guard, we had nothing come out of Bayport to help that ship. No planes, nothing would help.
Yeah, it's over an hour before the Air Force gets there and begins to drop flares. The rescuers would have taken even longer.
The next day, they had some called auxiliary Coast Guardmen, which were people who had pleasure boats, that were auxiliary Coast Guard. They went out there to look for survivors the next day. That's the only thing we saw for trying to help the people on those.
But thanks for the time. That's good. That's what I
early.
think. We'll get that second. I think what happens is, the official time is 10:20, but school was already in session. I know that in many parts of the country they didn't embrace this concept of year-round daylight savings time, even though that's what FDR wanted. One more thing. We'll just cruise to the end. The U-123. Hardigan's still alive. The U-123 goes back to the west coast of France, the Atlantic coast of France, which is where the submarine pens were. And after D-Day, the Germans have to abandon those submarine pens. So they scuttle the U-123 in, I think, September of 1944. Sometime after, maybe even earlier than that, but sometime after D-Day. And it sits on the bottom of the ocean until the war is over, at which point the French go and salvage the 123. They float her off the bottom. They fix her up. They rechristen her the Blason. And they keep her as an active ship in the French Navy until 1959. I think generally, this speech always goes a little bit differently, but I think generally that's everything. Did people have questions?
I just want to ask, did everyone on the tanker perish?
Good question. I left that out. 19 of 54 people on the tanker died in the conflagration. So 75 years ago today, 19 merchant marines and U.S. Navy personnel, more merchant marines obviously. There were 5 U.S. Navy personnel on the ship died. They perished.
How many survivors were there?
I'm sorry?
How many survivors?
Well, 54, 35. Right? Did you do the math? You're the math guy. Dave and I worked together for years. When he gets here, he says, "You're the speaker? Here, just talk to you." Just talk to you.
The survivors, how did they get to shore? Did they?
Well, they were picked up by Coast Guard predominantly. There's this
That night or
that
The next
night.
day, the Coast Guard auxiliary people had private boats left Mayport and went there and picked up the survivors.
Right.
They were pleasure boats, but they were Coast Guard auxiliary boats.
so from 9:30.
Basically, that night, most of them got picked up because there are 25 or 35 and 5 plus 12. I forget. Maybe 25 of the Marines, 5 of the merchant mariners, 5 of the Navy personnel out of the 7, and then 12 bodies, which doesn't add up to 54. They find the rest of the bodies later.
Was there guns on the Gulf of America?
Yes, the Gulf of America had a 3-inch deck gun. It was the first, it was on its maiden voyage. It was the first merchant vessel or tanker to be fitted with a deck gun. For whatever reason, they never attempted to return fire.
That's why the Navy crew was aboard to man that gun, to defend the ship.
And actually, the Navy goes out while that ship's still sitting there, and they take the deck gun off to use it again.
So, I've read about how the submarines would come between the ship and the shore, so the ship won't fire on shore.
I don't think that's what they were thinking, but possible. That's another reason. That's another reason they could have gone to shore. Hardigan in his diary, his war diary for that night, boasts that he has put on an impressive display for the tourists. A submarine naval gunfire, burning tankers, something not seen every day in America. And then he goes on to say all this was at Roosevelt's expense. You know, I mean, there were a variety of reasons he might have done that, but Hartigan was a bit of a glory hunter. He shows that over and over again. It's why he's one of the most famous submarine commanders ever. Yeah, go ahead.
After this event, all the lights along the coast had to be blacked out. They were all covered with black thing. All the street lights had things preventing them to be seen from out to sea. Cars had to have the top half of their headlights black.
You're absolutely right. Actually, Florida is the first state to have the blackout. And the day after, Governor Spessard Holland signs a bill or makes an executive order requiring that every beach town be blacked out. No more driving on the beach, headlights have to be blacked out. There's a neat, I got a neat clipping from May of 1942 from one of the local papers where they're building like a wood barricade at the end of the street to comply with the blackout. But Florida led. We were the first state to be blacked out. Also, they stopped shipping oil along the East Coast until May. Nothing like this ever happens in World War II. No, there are other ships sunk, but none this close to shore. None that where people can see. There's only 2 naval battles in the United States history where people on the shore could watch what was going on. And the other one is the monitoring the Merrimack.
Was the life-saving station active at that time, or?
Yes.
The lights.
And they say that there were boats there, and there's some stories about the boats. They kind of mentioned Townsend Hawks. Part of Townsend Hawks fame, he was a realtor in town, and he claimed that he and another gentleman took one of the boats and went out to try and rescue people, and were themselves, in fact, rescued. The newspaper talks about a visitor from the north named R. McCollum. No more information is given, who borrowed a boat and went out to try and help and got blown 20 miles off shore. And he's the last person to be rescued. And go ahead.
During the drills we had for blackouts, people with station wagons had to go to the old lifeguard station to report in case they were needed for ambulances. My father had an old wooden station wagon. He had to go there and stand by in case they were needed for ambulances.
Interesting. It's a fascinating event. I mean, there's no question. Go ahead.
I don't understand, maybe you can explain it, how the submarine could be damaged, but yet stay underwater and take out 2 more ships.
Well, what happened was they had some damages to some valves, and if you've ever seen Das Boot or any other World War II movie about submarines, those valves are always breaking in the movies. I don't know if they did it in real life or not. But they also had some trouble with the propeller. They also had some trouble. They were not leaking per se, but the propeller shaft was bent. And the batteries were drained, which is another thing that always happens in the movies. The batteries were drained, and they had difficulty actually getting to the surface so they could run the diesel engines to charge the batteries again. But whatever, they put it back together. Had the destroyer been a British destroyer, it would have stayed there and dropped depth charges for a day and a half. And year 1, 2, 3 would have been destroyed, yeah. They marvel about that. Actually, one other kind of interesting thing, the Dahlgren comes because of the sinkings 3 nights earlier. They don't even know, as they're dropping the depth charges on the 1, 2, 3, that the 1, 2, 3 has just sunk his ship off of Jack's Beach. They don't even have any idea at that point.
So they're just dropping them randomly?
As it turns out, nobody's for sure. The Germans were convinced that the destroyer knew where they were because the first and only array of depth charges was right on top of them. The records for the Dahlgren indicate that they weren't sure what they'd seen.
And where was the U-boat hit?
The U-boat depth charges would explode in the water around and create pressure, and ultimately that pressure could collapse the shell. But what it initially did was to damage the propellers and the screws and the valves. Sure.
Did you say he used the second to last torpedo?
Yes.
Well, then how did he sink 2 ships the next
He
time?
sunk one with a torpedo and one with his deck gun alone. And some people claim that Hartigan was the single greatest submarine user of deck guns ever. That nobody was as good at firing the deck gun as his crew. So they actually sank a freighter, was not a huge freighter, but a freighter with their deck gun, while 4 miles away another one that they had torpedoed was burning. You had to for him.
Was he at periscope depth, or was he surface when he fired his torpedo?
He was on the surface. He was on the surface the entire time from 6 p.m. until 10:20, and did not dive again until he realizes the Dahlgren is coming at him.
We watched that submarine forever on the surface right off Jacksonville Beach, firing its cannons and machine guns and tracers at the boat, at the tanker, and we couldn't do a thing about it. We had no defense at all, and we were so upset about it.
Oh, sure. It had, time goes by. When Hartigan comes here in 1992, one of his comments is, the people were pretty nice to me. You didn't expect that. You can imagine the outrage that people felt in 1942, and I don't want to diminish that at all. I mean, this is an outrageous event. And they were terrified. They were running around, turning lights on and off, scared to death that the Germans were going to start shelling the city, which they didn't do. And they were terrified. And they passed out guns. There's stories that people were given guns in order to defend the city, if need be.
I read in today's newspaper that his book is banned currently in Germany. Any idea why that is?
Yeah, he actually, I get quoted in that article a lot, by the way. The best quotes are attributed to some guy named Spencer. I don't know what he's doing, but that's me, I'm Spencer. And then there's some other quotes that are attributed to me, Scott A. Grant, and I don't know why, I gotta ask him why he did Spencer. I guess yell at him a little bit. But yeah, he got that from me. Because of the laws that we made them pass after World War II, it's illegal in Germany to sell anything with a swastika on it or a picture of Hitler. So you can sell the book if you're in Germany and you have a copy to somebody outside Germany. But you can't buy the book in Germany. And if you put the pictures up from inside the book, you need to censor out swastikas, other Nazi symbols, Hitler's face. So that's why you can't buy it. It's an incredibly expensive book. I kind of want one just because I got this interest in the story, but it costs a lot. It goes on auction like twice a year, and there's $400 or $500 a piece.
I'm just curious how many died in the actual explosion of the torpedo and how many were hit by the deck guns.
No one were hit. As far as we know, nobody was hit by the deck guns. However, the crew was scrambling to get off, and I believe that 1 or 2 people may have been injured or even killed in trying to get off. Because I know one of the boats, when the deck gun opens up, one of the boats, everybody jumps off the lifeboat, and that causes some problems as well. The biggest cause of death was oil, being covered by oil and burn. There's a story, and it's told 2 different times. It's attributed to 2 different people, but that when the Coast Guard went out and they were pulling one guy out of the sea, the skin just came off.
Pearl Harbor said the same thing.
Yeah. It was an awful event. I don't want to diminish it at all by telling the story. People were horrified. Just in case anybody's wondering, Hartigan was never prosecuted for this. A big reason was that none of the submarine commanders were prosecuted, and a big reason none of the submarine commanders were prosecuted was when they tried Admiral Dönitz. One of the defense witnesses on his behalf was Admiral Nimitz, who was the U.S. admiral in charge of the entire Navy. And his testimony is, yeah, we basically did the same thing our submarines basically did the same things as the Germans. We went out and we sank merchant ships. We didn't give them any warning. We saw them, we sank them. Go ahead.
Did the Germans come on shore here during the war?
Well, the woman talked before. They're in June, 2 months from now.
Just them?
Just those 4 saboteurs. There's no evidence that any other Germans came ashore. I know that on this voyage, the second voyage, that the photographer asked to go to shore in St. Augustine, and they said no. But that's the only time. There's stories that they go to bakeries, and if the Germans sneak ashore and go to bakeries, they're generally considered not to be true. I mean, it's hard to disprove that something never happened, but generally they say no, those stories are urban legends. The Germans did come ashore, buy bread at wholesome bakeries, and then paddle back out to the ship. Go, sure, go ahead.
I imagine that surveillance was beefed up
Oh, yeah.
along the coastline with citizens.
And there would have been civil defense people. You know, and in fact, a lot of that existed already. But in 1942, we were concentrated on an air strike, a bombing. The Germans were going to come and bomb us. So most of our work in terms of civil defense was concentrated against bombers that never came and ignored the submarines that did.
And they were looking at the west coast.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah, but
You might want to run the film on your face. There's a lot of people out here that could not see it.
yeah, I'll stay around too for the people outside if you want to come in and we can look. But we can definitely, I'll run film again. I just need one of the tech people. Go ahead, man.
Did you say that the ship did get into Mayport?
Yeah, the U-123 goes into Mayport
Why didn't we do that?
because there was nobody there. I mean, there was probably somebody there, but there were no ships there at that point. Mayport builds up later, and again, not impugning Mayport. There were no ships anywhere. In March or April of 1942, the New York Times runs a headline, and the headline is, "Where is the Navy?" And again, not anything against the Navy, and anybody's in the Navy. I love the Navy, you're all great. But in 1942, we weren't ready. You know, we know that. And that's why they were able to sink so many ships.
Was this event censored in the local press, similar to the ones down at Fort Pierce?
Oh yeah, you know, the only article that runs locally at the time is April 16th, which is 6 days later. There's a man on board who's, I think, the chief engineer, whose last name is Gear. I think like Vasco da Gama Gear. And he was from Jacksonville, so most of the story is about him. His most interesting quote is, he says, "I wish we'd had a chance to fire our guns."